Wow, I learned so much about deinstitutionalization through reading the chapters and watching the video. I honestly didn't have that much prior knowledge of deinstitutionalization before this, but what I did know was that asylums were run by the state and that they were very bad conditions. They were unclean and inhumane treatments. I actually had the opportunity to tour a asylum in Virginia. It was obviously vacated, and I was in 7th grade, and it was really scary. They were looked like jail cells, and there were bolts where chains had been on the wall. It was just such a cold feeling there, and I had nightmares of it for weeks. But that was my extent of knowledge on asylums. But I knew after that people saw this as inhumane treatment to the mentally ill, and so they deinstitutionalized and brought people out of the asylums and into the community. But the downfall of that was I don't feel like there was much preparation for that. There was really, after that, there was nowhere else for them to go. And, human services was an active part in case management to the mentally ill. But other than that, the video shows that most, these mentally ill men are in and out of prison, and it's a constant cycle. They are in their meds and they're fine, and then they one day decide, I don't need my medication, and start taking it, and then maybe like a month later, they're back in prison. And this happens over and over again for really could be their entire lifespan. What I found interesting was that each of the men in the video knew and acknowledged that they needed medication and that the medication made them feel better. And they knew what they did was wrong and that they knew they needed to take medication. But what I find interesting is they kept not taking it and ending back up in jail. One of the men, I believe his name was, I think it was Len Moore. He was like, oh, I didn't take my medication because I wasn't having delusions anymore, so I didn't think I needed it. And obviously he wasn't having delusions anymore because he was on his medication. And actually, Len Moore is one of the men I want to highlight. He had been arrested and released for over 20 times. And when the camera crew people interviewed with him, this was his 4th time in prison, and it was for breaking and entering because he thought that he was going after bin Laden, and obviously that was a delusion. And it was because he stopped taking his medicine and was in relapsed, and so he was back in prison again. But what I did think was interesting to see in the video with Len Moore was the treatment team meeting. And because that's what I'm learning about in human services, and also I'm learning in case management and the questions that they asked him, and specifically when he met with his case manager alone, and they were going over objectives and goals for him. That was actually the chapter we just read in my case management class, so it's cool to make that connection. They need the objective for him to apply to a job once a week, and it was cool to see Len Moore vocal in that, and the case manager involving him in that objective and them doing it together. So that was really neat to see. But one thing I'd like to point out about him also is that he had no parole or supervision after he left the jail. And so he did have case manager, but other than that, he was in a halfway house, like a home shelter, that where he was staying, and they took a breathalyzer to let him in, and so he was doing fine, but he had nobody keeping him on track to take his medication, and so then he slipped up and he failed the breathalyzer, and he left, and he had nowhere to go. and so he stopped taking his medication, and within a week ended up back in jail, and the cycle continued. And I honestly think it's because he didn't have constant supervision to help keep him on track. And in contrast, Benny Annie was in and out of prison, and he actually was so actively psychotic that he was seen by a mental health court that believed he should be treated instead of put in prison. And so he went through this treatment plan, and he had a psychiatrist who was in a group home, and all of the people that were helping him were emphasizing to him every time they met with him, medicine, medicine, medicine. And then 2 weeks before his court date, he stopped taking his medicine and ended back in jail. And so I thought that was interesting that both men, one had that constant supervision and one did not. And both men ended up back in the same place. I'm not sure if there's something that correlates there, but I thought that was interesting. But the one success story of this video, it was only 7 months of success, but I hope it was a lifetime of success afterwards, since this was only made in 2009. Wow, 9 years. William Stokes, he was also in and out of prison and had a history of refusing medication, but when the camera crew talked with him, he talked about how he could tell that medicine made a difference in his life, and how he wanted to get better. And so he did not have any parole or supervision afterwards either, and so that is why this particular residential facility made a point to take him in, because they knew that without that supervision he'd end back where he was, just as Len Moore did, who did not have that supervision. And so he was put in this residential facility, and not only was it a housing for him, but also gave him treatment. And I think that that is a successful release plan, being in a residential facility, because case managers are there and they gave them treatment and therapy and help them get on their feet and keep them up with their medication, and just give them the whole 9 yards as far as I see. Then one more thing I'd like to point out is that it was interesting to me at the end. One of the men talking in the video said he was not by any means advocating for asylums again, but he said that we need to figure out how to divert to not to divert to state prisons or jails, but to something else. And that got me thinking, there has to be something in between asylums and prisons. What is that in between, and what is a good treatment for these individuals? And so, yeah, this is what I learned. Thanks for watching and listening.